Adriana has long specialized in community journalism. In her hometown, Chicago, she spent over a decade working as a media educator, journalist, and radio producer. Today, she is an engagement reporter at ProPublica, an investigative newsroom based in New York City, and an adjunct faculty at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. Her reporting has contributed to several awards, including a Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, a George Polk Award, a Peabody, and a Pulitzer Prize finalist series for explanatory reporting on maternal mortality in the U.S. Adriana has also traveled the country with the StoryCorps mobile booth, collecting hundreds of stories archived at the Library of Congress. Everyone, Adriana Gallardo.
Thank you for having me. I dedicate this talk to my nephew, Emilian. Thank you for coming, Gordo. Glad to see you here. The act of deleting, omitting, or leaving parts out of a story is called erasure. When we talk about Mexicans in the media, and media about Mexicans, it's important to consider what is being said about us, but it's equally important to consider what is not being said. We are often ignored for our humanity, for our history, and we can blame the media, but if we're honest, we are very much part of the media today. We probably consume more of each other's stories than any other piece of information, right? We stay all day on our phones curating the story that we want to tell about ourselves, the story, probably better said, that we want the audience to think is our story. And that's not very different than what the media does, right? That's an act of decision making. And as we stay making decisions, we need to consider this question of erasure. So I think about stories all day. I do this for a living. I'm a reporter at ProPublica in New York City. New York is cool. I still love Chicago way more. Please let that be known. And my focus in this work is to bring to the reporting process from start to finish the people that are most affected by the stories we tell. And everything I know about how to do about my job comes from this place. It comes from Chicago. And it comes from a very specific place. Who remembers Radio Arte? Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so glad. Radio, shout out to 18th and Blue Island. Shout out to Silvia Rivera, who's my lifelong mentor. Pilsen, shout out, for sure. For those of you who don't know, Radio Arte was a tiny community radio station where I learned the power of letting people decide the stories that need to be told about them. Not because we need to explain ourselves to a larger audience, but because our stories are coming from a place of need. And that's a need for survival. And stories and survival go hand in hand. Stories are one of the very few things that can't be taken away from us. And I know we're in dark times, and it's hard to resist despair. We're being targeted, we're being caged, we're being murdered. It sounds fake as it comes out of my mouth, but we know this is the reality. And a lot of those narratives are happening incomplete of the full story, right? They're getting away with doing this because they've erased our humanity and they've erased a big part of our history. I've learned the hard way that the first stories we can correct are the ones we tell ourselves. In early 2017, I got to go down to the border. I went to the part where Eagle Pass and Texas meet. We were going to a town called Allende, where the Zetas carried out a massacre in 2011. I was there with my colleague, Ginger Thompson, who had weaved together a monumental oral history of this massacre. While Ginger and I were there, we sat on the banks of the Rio Grande, right on the Mexico side, and there was families on both sides. Going back to this particular place was important for me on many levels. It was a place where my own family had crossed 30 years earlier, almost to the day. And I sat there with Ginger, and I told her the story that I always tell, a story I've been repeating since I was a kid. I told her that we were brought over on an air raft, that I was 4 years old, my brother was just 3 months old, that it was scary only because we didn't want my mom to fall over into the water, but we got over safely. My dad was on the other side, and we were on a plane to Chicago a few days later. I repeated luck probably a dozen times in that story. I kept saying I was lucky, I was saying that we had luck, and I really wanted to draw a straight line from a kid in the late 80s on an air raft to a woman there sitting on assignment, right? I used luck to ignore the parts of my story that I wasn't ready to hear. The true story, the one that I had been avoiding, had been growing on my body for the last 16 years in the shape of tattoos. Now, you may not like tattoos, you may hate tattoos, you may think they're ugly. Hear me out. This is how I worked it out with myself. A few years after I got my first tattoo, my brother became a phenomenal tattoo artist and quickly became my co-conspirator in my tattoos. So we would talk a lot about the things that I thought I was getting tattoos of separate memories that were important to me. I didn't understand them to be a story that was connected until I went to the border and I struggled for the next 2 years to make sense of that moment. And I really struggled. Let me tell you, it threw me for a loop. But let me tell you about a few of them so they make a little bit more sense. So on the back of my arm right here, I have a garbage can with a few flowers tossed inside. When I shut my eyes and I think about my childhood, I see my mother in a loud plastic garbage can full of bolsas, the way the janitors push those. I grew up behind my mother in that garbage can. My family grew up cleaning. We were a janitor family. We cleaned anything from the YMCAs to strip malls to churches, factories. You named it, we were there, and we were there together. I wanted to remember, well, one step back. My favorite place we cleaned was the local public library. For 12 years, my parents cleaned the library in Elgin, where my brother and I got to run around while it was closed and my parents were cleaning. So I got to learn about all types of things. We got to do, the art projects. We got to do tons of stuff while the library was closed. And it was in this place where my love for language, for books, for journalism was born while my parents cleaned. So it was very important to me to have a memory of that on my arm, to remember that we got a lot of good from their trash, that probably some of the best memories of my life were those long days, early, sometimes really early mornings while we were cleaning as a family. And I never wanted to forget that I was the janitor's kid before I was anything else. On the other side of the garbage can, right here, I have a piece of corn and it looks just like an elote. Imagine taking off all of the fixings, just a little bit more elegant. That's my tat. It's a piece of corn that resembles the texture of wood for my two grandparents. My mother's father was a corn farmer in Jalisco, and my father's father is a carpenter. Papa Julio, my mother's father, raised my mother, who was the second of 17 children, and his favorite. That's no secret. My mom was his favorite. Papa Julio was 6 feet tall and loved to tell a good story. He had this encyclopedic memory of their town called Matanzas, right in Jalisco. My grandfather even grew food for the United States in the 1950s as part of the Bracero program, one of millions of workers that were brought from Mexico to offer labor during a shortage during and after World War II. Mi abuelito Angel, my father's father, who still lives, he's 96 years old, and he still tries to make things. He is my father's face, only 30 years older. And soon after I was born, we moved next door to his tienda, where I grew up, for the first few years of my life, sitting on his counter, learning to tell terrible jokes and getting spoiled with candy and pretending I ran the store. And I really missed him when we left. When I learned to write, he was my first pen pal. And he would write back to me in these huge block letters on yellow paper. And that place that my parents come from, the place of corn and wood, now lives on my body in the shape of this tattoo. I also have 2 words in Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs, the pre-Columbian language. Those are on my back. And I was a Latin American Studies minor at Loyola here on the north side. And when I learned that there were languages before Spanish and English, it just blew my mind. I was like, what? No one told me about this. There was people that were saying beautiful things, that wrote beautiful poetry, that figured out the sky and the calendar and all types of things. I had no idea. The 2 words I have represent wisdom and writing. It's called Tliji and Tlapaji. And in Aztec and Nahuatl philosophy, it was the way to truth. It was the combination that led the pathway for the knowers of things. And I graduated with a degree in journalism from Loyola. And though the Aztecs didn't call it journalism, I felt that we agreed on the rules of the game, right? There was wisdom, there's wisdom, there's writing, and there's truth, right? And I became a journalist to do exactly that, to revisit difficult stories and complicated places, to find stories worth telling because they might carry a truth we're ignoring. After I returned from that trip to the border, I slowly began to ask questions. And my parents' answers were exactly what I didn't want to hear. I didn't want to know that they got to the border without a plan. I didn't want to know that it was on my mother's insistence that we all came along, and that it took a full week of door knocking for them to find anyone who would smuggle a young woman with a newborn and a toddler. That it was February and it was cold and we didn't bring many clothes. When I started listening, when I traded the half-constructed memories, and I bothered to really look, the details started to arrive as if I had invited them. Just after last Christmas, we were eating a meal and my mom's memory jumped back to those days at the border. She told me that we ate the same street tacos for every meal because that was all they could afford. That I complained and it broke her heart, but that was all they had. I asked about where we stayed. She said it was a dingy and dark hotel with no running water, no running hot water. That my brother got very sick. And when we talk about how sick he got, she casually mentioned she was breastfeeding throughout this whole trip, a detail that I never considered, even though I knew that my brother was a newborn when we were crossing. That image of my mother breastfeeding a sick baby in the cold with nowhere to go drained any last drop of romance I had kept for my story. Soon after, we were on a car ride on a rainy night to a Bulls game, and my parents casually mentioned that while we were looking for a coyote, they got caught in a similar rainstorm, and that a very nice, well-dressed cab driver gave us a free ride back to the hotel. Correcting my own story means probably seeing what that cab driver saw when he decided to pull over and help. It is seeing my parents out in the cold rain, broke as could be, holding on to their 2 kids until something gave. Turning around wasn't an option, and our eventual path to citizenship couldn't have been further from that point. But they held on to each other, and they held on to the belief that my brother and I were worth all that risk and all that uncertainty. When my parents left home, they didn't count on luck to get them through. They counted on each other. They counted on their tireless work ethic, and they counted on the aspirations that any young parent might have for their children. By calling it luck, I had erased so much of myself. I had really cheated myself out of hard-earned truths. So I tell you tonight, let's not wait for the media or others to see us. The stories that are going to lead to our survival are going to come from each other and from ourselves. So maybe on your way home tonight or tomorrow morning or sometime soon, but do it and do it often. Share a story from your family with your loved ones that you can't afford to be erased, that you can't afford to forget. Because to forget is to erase, and we cannot be erased. Thank you.